Welcome back to Inside My Library. This is Al-Bayan wal-Ta'reef في أسباب wurud al Hadith al-Shareef by Ibrahim ibn Muhammad Kamal al-Din ibn Husayn, Burhan al-Din ibn Hamzah al-Husayni al-Hanafi, known as Ibn Husayn al-Hanafi al-Dimashqi. He was a linguist and a scholar of Hadith from the prominent people of Damascus. Born in 1054 or 1645, he was educated in Damascus, worked there for some time, and then he traveled to Egypt to learn from the scholars of Egypt. He's recorded to have traveled in his studies as far as Rome as well. In 1093, he assumed the position of the Naqib, or the registrar of the Ashraf in Egypt, and that's the person who's in charge of recording all the births, deaths, and marriages of al-Bayt, and generally supervising family relations. After this, he returned to Damascus and he assumed the same position there. His teachers were about 80 in number, as is mentioned in his biographical material. He died in the year 1120 Hijri, or 1708 in the Gregorian calendar, at a place called Dhat al-Hajj, as he was returning from Hajj, and he's buried there at that place. He was not a prolific writer, and there's only two works of his that have reached us. The first is a marginalia on Ibn Musannaf's explanation of the Alfiyya of Imam Malik, and the other is this, Al-Bayan wal-Ta'reef fi Asbab wurud al Hadith al-Shareef, or a clarification of the reasons why hadith are said. This book explores the hadith genre in a manner that's perhaps fitting for the age that it was written in. While early generations wrote hadith works, they expounded on those through things called mustakhrajat and ajza and amali, all different types of secondary and tertiary works that gathered the various narrations of a particular hadith to place it in greater context. Early scholars of hadith used to say, I can never understand a narration until I've collected it from at least 40 different sources. لا أفهم الحديث حتى أجمعه من 40 وجها. So the holistic understanding of that hadith, the context surrounding it, and the various effects that its numerous narrations have on it would all be taken into consideration in that early period. The culmination of this process in the early period was what resulted in many of what we know today as canonical books of hadith, like Bukhari, Muslim, Nasa'i, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, the Muwatta of Malik, and the Musnad of Ahmed. These books were then met by explanations and marginalia. Those attempted to provide some context that early scholars enjoyed from their collection of hadith and the knowledge of its context and its various supporting narrations. As works went on, there were later more derivative works that shied away from this holistic approach of mentioning all these different narrations or explanations, and they would only mention the pertinent parts of a hadith that they were using for their area of expertise. So, for example, an author in legal theory might only mention إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are by intention, and then only expound on the various types of intention, the concept of actions, what is an action, what does it entail, is abandoning an action as well, and all of the various concepts that relate to it. He would be utterly unconcerned with the reason this hadith was said at all. Another, more modern author may read this hadith and wonder why فَمَنْ هَاجَرَ إِلَى امْرَأَةٍ يَنْكِحُهَا, whoever emigrates due to a woman that he wants to marry is mentioned. They might suppose that this perhaps implies that early Muslim scholars were concerned with more misogynistic overtones and that women were only singled out because of that. An author of Islamic law may be only concerned with the legitimacy of the actions alluded to in the hadith. She may elucidate how and why an action is valid, when and if the intention related to it is correct, and then cite only a portion of this hadith as well. So what al-Husayni attempts in this book is to gather the contextual clues from other works for popular phrases such as actions are by intention, relying on secondary and tertiary sources mentioned above, outside of the canonical works, or clues that are in some canonical sources but maybe not in others. Say, for example, hadith is mentioned it as only a portion in al-Bukhari, but the story behind it's in Abu Dawud. For example, this hadith, actions are by intention, and every man will have what he intended. So whoever emigrates for God and his messenger, his emigration is for God and his messenger. And whoever emigrates to marry a woman, he will have what his emigration was for. He covers this hadith, and we'll use it here as an example. He mentions that a narration in Akhbar al-Madina by Zubair ibn Bakkar, that a group of companions arrived in Medina and shortly thereafter fell ill. They were sitting in the masjid, and then a man arrived by himself. And he had come there to marry a woman who had migrated. The Prophet ﷺ, seeing these people, ascended his mimbar, and then he said this hadith. So the context clues are mentioned in the Sunan of Sa'id ibn Mansur that the woman's name was Qais. And Ibn Mas'ud said, we used to call that man the emigrant to Qais, Muhajiru Qais. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid said it was for this purpose that a woman was mentioned as an example of things emigrated to the exclusion of all other worldly things that could have been mentioned as examples. Another example of understanding or what this book attempts to achieve is the hadith, إِنَّمَا أَأْكُلْ كَمَا يَأْكُلُ الْعَبْدُ وَإِنَّمَا أَجْلِسُ كَمَا يَجْلِسُ الْعَبْدُ. I eat as a slave eats, and I sit as a slave sits. Found in the four Sunan from the hadith of Aisha. Legal theorists pointed to the implications of the hadith, and they talked about its legal import. Was the Prophet designating for us how we should sit and eat? Or was he saying how we must sit and eat this way? Was this merely an example of his etiquette or an indication of recommendation, or was it an indication of obligation? They all talked about these things. But when we go back and we look at the supporting narrations in other works of hadith like Al-Hakim and the Shama'il and others, we get context clues that an angel came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, Inna rabbaka yuqri'uka salam, your Lord sends you greetings and offers you a choice. He offers takuna nabiyyan malikan, that you can be a prophet king, aw an takuna abdan, that you can be a slave. Gabriel then points to the Prophet ﷺ and tells him to choose. So the Prophet ﷺ says, Bal abdan nabiyyan, I will be a slave and a prophet. So after this incident, he ﷺ would never be seen reclining while eating. And he would say, I eat like a slaves eat, because reclining while eating was something that kings and people of prominence did. So this hadith has been discussed to a considerable extent in works about af'al al-Nabi, Prophet's actions and their legal import. And we'll probably review some of those here and inside my library later. What this does is allows the jurist, the theologian, the writer, the reader, the ability to assume less about what's in the hadith and its underlying reasoning, concentrate more on the legal, theological, and social factors that played a role in any particular phrase being uttered. So this work by al-Husayni is quite valuable and one in which needs considerable study and expansion. He actually states this himself in the introduction, and he says, what I've mentioned here is an example for those who would like to take to this path and an introduction for those who would like to write at length about this topic. He's clearly inviting you, the reader, to expand upon his work, just as he himself expanded upon an earlier work by Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, whose contents only numbered about 100 hadith. Al-Husayni, in his book, he gets up to about 1,000 hadith, but he only gets through the letters of Alif and Ba. And at times, quite frankly, he falls short in creating the context around certain hadith. He'll at times substantiate a context for a hadith based solely on a topical similarity and then an actual context which is found in supporting narrations. And perhaps that's just because of the references and resources that were available. So, should this book be an essential part of your library? Not necessarily, but if you're specializing in hadith, trying to tackle issues like this, context in this genre, and you don't want to fall into applying anachronistic understandings to them, then this is a great start. Let me hear from you in the comments what you are interested in about this hadith. Do you have it? Have you read it? Are you interested in reading it? And if there's anything like it, what do you recommend? If you've enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe, share it with your friends, and let me hear from you in the comments about what else you'd like to see, and I'll see you next time inside my library.